The basement never truly warms, no matter how many winters pass overhead. Concrete sweats in the cold, and metal shelves carry a faint echo when a hand brushes against them. At this hour, the sheriff's building in Alderford County is quiet. Just a few distant footsteps, a door clicking shut far away, the low hum of fluorescent lights. In the depths of the storage floor, where dust gathers in thin lines along forgotten boxes, a single motion breaks the stillness. A cardboard crate is slid onto a table by gloved hands, its surface worn down to soft fuzz from years of handling. The label, once crisp, is yellowed and slanted from humidity. Someone has traced a finger across it so many times that the ink is slightly smudged. Kline, E-1993. No dramatic markings, no warnings. Just a name, a date, and the weight of a town that has never managed to forget. Detective Maya Ortiz stands over the box in the narrow corridor of light. Behind her, the shelves stretch into the dim, holding decades of old pain. The air tastes metallic, the way sealed spaces often do when they've held secrets for too long. She isn't expecting revelations tonight. Her task is routine: update inventory, ensure preservation, document anything at risk. But the moment she lifts the lid, something shifts. Not in the room, but inside her chest, as if a door eases open by a fraction. The contents are arranged with the kind of deliberate care that belongs to another era. Paper envelopes sealed with brittle tape, Polaroids curled at the edges. A stack of typed reports clipped with rusting brads. And nestled among them, cushioned in folded archival padding, is the smallest and quietest item in the case. A glass vial, sealed in steel, a faint ring of frost clinging to the inside despite the controlled room temperature. Maya reaches for it, her glove whispering against the plastic sleeve. There's nothing remarkable about the vial itself. It is no different from the hundreds on other shelves, each holding a fragment of untold stories. But something about this one feels different, older, suspended in time. Preserved long before the world knew what such evidence might someday be capable of revealing. A data sheet clipped beneath, it indicates a single word under testing results. Unmatched. She lifts the vial to the light. A small, still world rests inside the glass, its significance dormant but undeniable. A whisper of a life extinguished and a truth that refused to decay. Outside the storage room, a hallway clock clicks to the top of the hour. The sheriff's building settles, the way aging structures do in the cold. Maya places the vial on the table and leans closer, her breath steady. The moment feels almost intrusive, as though she is trespassing in a chapter of Maple Run's past that has been locked away for decades. Her phone buzzes. A text from the lab liaison in Columbus reminds her of the new state partnerships for cold case DNA submissions, for cases with preserved samples, for evidence that waited too long. For exactly this, she looks back down at the vial. Years ago, when Detective Greeley oversaw this case, none of this would have been possible. The technology, the databases, the genealogical networks, none of it existed. The past was close to them. But the world has changed since then. The science has changed. And this tiny glass container, sealed against time, is now more powerful than it ever was on the day it was collected. Maya signs the chain of custody form with slow, deliberate strokes. The pen's tip scrapes faintly on the paper, the sound sharp in the quiet room. The moment is small, almost forgettable. Yet the atmosphere carries an undercurrent, like wind shifting before a storm breaks. She seals the evidence for transport. As she walks down the hallway, carrying the box carefully against her chest, fragments of Maple Run's history rise in her mind. The annual memorials. The old teacher who still keeps Elena Kline's photograph on her desk. The families who no longer allow their children to walk to school alone. The smiles of neighbors who never imagined a killer could be one of them. The way the town never stopped glancing over its shoulder, even after all these years. At the exit door, Maya pauses. Frost glitters on the glass, catching the glow of the security light outside. She feels the cold through her coat as she steps into the night, exhaling a small cloud that dissolves into the darkness. The box presses lightly against her palms, and she thinks about the weight of silence, how it accumulates, how it waits, how it eventually becomes too heavy to ignore. The engine of her county car turns over reluctantly. As she drives, the town unspools around her. Empty diners, grain silos looming like quiet sentinels, snow-dusted fields stretching into the dark. This is a place shaped by routine, by trust, by the belief that people are who they appear to be. It's a belief that once shattered cannot be fully restored. She does not yet know the name that this vial will lead her to. She does not know which familiar face will collapse under the truth. But she knows this. Something long buried is about to rise. At a red light, she glances at the evidence box resting on the passenger seat. The vial's cold gleam catches her eye through a gap in the padding. To understand how this began, we go back to 1993. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. It helps us bring more truth to light. On most mornings in Maple Run, the day begins long before the sun decides to rise. Lights flicker on in the kitchens of farmhouses, and the smell of cold soil blends with the first whiffs of coffee drifting from cracked kitchen windows. In a small rental house on County Line Road, Elena Kline followed the same rhythm. She was never someone who hit the alarm more than once. Her routines weren't rigid. They simply helped her feel settled, like the world made more sense when the day was built on small, purposeful steps. She would wake with a stretch, walk barefoot across the cool wooden floor, and fill a kettle at the sink. The house was old, slightly drafty, but she liked how it felt lived in. Her mother called it quaint, while her father insisted it was too isolated for his liking. Elena loved it for the quiet. She said the silence helped her think about her lesson plans without distraction, that the drive to Maple Run Elementary gave her time to prepare for the chaos and laughter waiting in her classroom. When the kettle steamed, she would sit by the window with her tea. The view wasn't much, just the gentle slope of fields still bare in the early spring and a dirt road winding between farms. But she liked watching the morning form itself, the way the fog lifted slowly like a curtain revealing the day. Sometimes she saw trucks heading toward the feed mill, their headlights glowing in the mist. Other times it was only the sound of wind brushing past the glass. Elena kept a small corkboard beside the kitchen table, filled with children's drawings. Most of them were uneven crayon landscapes or misshapen animals, but each one was signed in careful handwriting. Her students adored her. They brought pictures, notes, sometimes even small objects from home that they thought she would like. She pinned them all. She said it made the house feel less empty. At school, her classroom was tucked at the end of a long hallway that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and dry erase markers. Her desk was always clean, except for the stacks of worksheets she arranged by subject and the jar of brightly colored pens she used to mark homework. On the board, she wrote the day's schedule in tidy lettering. Even other teachers admired how she kept things orderly without the sterility that made some classrooms feel stiff. Her room seemed warm, alive, covered in student art and construction paper projects that dangled from string. Children would greet her with small stories about their pets, siblings, or tiny triumphs before the first bell. She had a way of kneeling to meet their eyes, listening fully, as if each story mattered. And it did to her. She believed that giving attention was a form of respect, a lesson more important than multiplication tables or spelling rules. During lunch, she often sat with her friend and fellow teacher, Melissa. They shared simple meals, laughing about the unpredictable things third graders said. Melissa would roll her eyes dramatically as she described running out of glue sticks or mediating playground arguments, while Elena calmly offered solutions, always optimistic, always finding a way to repair whatever had cracked during the morning. After school, Elena usually lingered while the hallways emptied. She liked preparing the next day's materials and the quiet that followed the final bell. She would hum softly as she arranged books or wrote on the board. Sometimes she caught sight of her reflection in the classroom window, hair pulled loosely back, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands chalk dusted, and she felt an uncomplicated sense of belonging. She was still young, still forming herself, but teaching felt like the truest version of who she wanted to become. Her parents called in the evenings. They checked in, not because they distrusted her independence, but because she was their only child, and this habit helped bridge the distance. Her father would ask about her car, whether it was running smoothly. Her mother asked if she was eating well or seeing anyone new. Elena would laugh and deflect, promising both parents she was fine, well-fed, and safe. She spent her free time reading or preparing materials for her students. Sometimes she bought inexpensive decorations for seasonal projects, paper hearts, cut-out flowers, ribbons for bulletin boards. She kept them in neatly labeled boxes on a shelf near her bed. For her, the classroom wasn't just a workplace. It was an extension of her life, a space built from patience and care. There were small symbolic habits she carried quietly. She kept a river stone on her nightstand, smooth and pale, which she picked up during a childhood trip with her father. She kept a worn notebook filled with short reflections about her students, not grades or behavior notes, but observations about who they were becoming. She believed these thoughts mattered as much as any report card. She also kept every thank you note she ever received. They were tucked into a shoebox, tied with ribbon. Whenever she felt overwhelmed, she would sit cross-legged on her bed and read through them, letting the words anchor her. These were the things that reminded her she made a difference. On her last day at school, she stood a little longer by the corkboard, adjusting one of the drawings that had begun to curl at the edges. It showed a house with a bright red roof and a teacher drawn taller than the sun. The child who gave it to her had said, with absolute seriousness, that she was the best helper in the whole world. She smiled at that memory as she straightened the paper. She spent lunchtime making copies for a geography lesson she planned to teach the next morning. It was going to be about Ohio's river systems, and she had picked out a series of maps to help the kids learn how to trace waterways with their fingers. She laid them out across her desk, imagining how each student would work through the exercise. Her mind moved in small, thoughtful steps, the way it always did. Before leaving, she wrote the next day's date on the board. It was a habit. She liked arriving in the morning to see the day already announced, as if she had left a small welcome note for herself. As she drove home, she tuned into the local radio station. A familiar voice was speaking between songs, upbeat and friendly. She didn't pay close attention. It was just background noise, the kind she barely registered during the ride. She rolled down the window slightly, letting the cold air fill the car. The fields around her were still bare, waiting for spring planting. She felt hopeful in the way she often did on the drive home, imagining her students' faces lighting up during the next day's lesson. She made one last phone call that evening. It was to her mother, who asked about her day. Elena talked about the geography lesson, the drawing she'd fixed on her kitchen corkboard, and the stack of papers she still needed to grade before the weekend. Her mother told her she sounded tired, and she promised to go to bed early. When she hung up the phone, she turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the quiet. The house felt peaceful, the kind of calm she cherished. She straightened the corner of a map she'd left on the table and reached for the river stone on her nightstand before settling under the covers. She had no way of knowing that this would be the last night she would see her home as she left it. No way of knowing that the world she had built so carefully, so kindly, would soon fracture in a way her students, her parents, and her community would struggle to understand for years to come. The morning of March 12, 1993 began like the others, wrapped in the stillness that came before the sun reached the eastern line of fields. A thin frost clung to mailboxes and fence rails along County Line Road, and the narrow stretch of pavement shone with the faint shimmer of ice. The air was cold enough that each breath seemed to sharpen as it left the lungs. Most houses remained dark at that hour, their windows blank squares against the pre-dawn blue. But one small rental home, the one Elena Kline had made her own, held a quiet that felt different. The timeline starts with absence. At 7:04 a.m., a staff member at Maple Run Elementary called Elena's home phone after she didn't arrive for her scheduled morning hall duty. She never missed it. It was one of those responsibilities she took on voluntarily, greeting early arrivals with a warm hello. When she didn't answer the phone, the office tried again, assuming she might simply be running late or caught in traffic on the icy roads. The second call also went unanswered. By 7:18, the school secretary reached the principal, who had just arrived and was shrugging off his coat. He paused, confused. Elena was always reliable. He made another call himself. The phone rang into the quiet of her kitchen, reverberating against the wooden table where she'd left her lesson maps the night before, but no one lifted the receiver. At 7:31, the principal asked Melissa, her close friend and colleague, to drive by her house. Melissa agreed immediately. She knew Elena well enough to understand that something felt off. As she drove down County Line Road, the fields around her still appeared washed in blue-gray, the sky suspended between night and day. The tires crunched softly on the thin ice. When she approached the small house, she felt a flicker of unease. Elena's car sat in the driveway, lightly dusted with frost. The walkway bore no footprints. The front window blinds were tilted at slightly uneven angles, as if someone had brushed past them. Melissa stepped out of her car. The quiet pressed against her ears. She called Elena's name, first softly, then louder. No answer came from inside. She walked toward the door, noticing the faint condensation on the pane of glass. The doorknob felt cold beneath her hand. She knocked. The hollow thud was the only sound. She knocked again and waited. Nothing. She tried the door, knowing it was likely locked. When the latch clicked and the door pushed inward, she froze. It shouldn't have opened. Elena always locked it. Always. Melissa hesitated, calling her name again into the dimness beyond the threshold. The morning light didn't reach far inside. The interior was shadowed, the air still. She stepped only a few feet inside before fear finally took shape. Something felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain. She backed out, her breath unsteady, and hurried to her car. By 7:45, she was calling the sheriff's department. Deputies arrived at 7:57. Their flashlights pierced the quiet of the house, beams moving across walls painted in gentle tones and over objects left undisturbed. A chair pulled slightly away from the table, a mug in the sink. The river stone on the nightstand, undisturbed as always. Nothing was overturned, nothing broken. That was the first unsettling detail, the normalcy. They followed the narrow hallway toward the living room, and it was there the silence gave way to truth. Elena lay motionless, and the simple order of her home contrasted painfully with the stillness of her body. The investigators paused, taking in the details with practiced precision. No drawers rifled through, no signs of forced entry. The scene conveyed not chaos, but violation intertwined with control. One deputy stepped toward the front door and examined the lock. It bore no marks. No scratches, no damage to the frame, no indication of a tool. The door had been opened either by someone she trusted or someone familiar enough with the house to approach without hesitation. While deputies secured the perimeter, the lead investigator, Detective Paul Greeley, walked through the house slowly, using the early light filtering through the blinds. He noted the way the thin slats struggled to brighten the room, the patterns of faint shadow across the floor, the cold in the air that lingered longer than it should have inside a closed home. He moved from detail to detail, his attention steady. He noticed Elena's purse hanging from the hook near the door, exactly where she always left it. Her keys were still inside. That removed one theory immediately. She had not been preparing to leave. On the kitchen counter, the light caught the edge of a stack of maps she had prepared for her students. They fanned out across the table in soft paper arcs, still aligned in the order she placed them. Beside them was a note she had scribbled to herself about the river systems she wanted to test the class on. It was dated for the day she never reached. Forensics technicians arrived shortly after and began their work. They moved with quiet focus, marking areas of interest. They took samples from the floor, swabbed surfaces, and photographed every angle with measured precision. At the center of their attention was the biological evidence they found, preserved enough to offer hope even then. They placed it in a small glass vial before sealing it in a labeled sleeve. Detectives could not have known at the time how important that sample would become, how it would outlive the tools of its era and wait for technology that had not been invented yet. No items were taken from the home, nothing was stolen. The absence of theft forced investigators to consider other motives, personal, opportunistic, or something darker that did not require any trace left behind except presence. The lack of forced entry remained the most troubling fact. Someone had crossed her threshold without breaking it. By midday, the road outside Elena's home was lined with curious onlookers behind makeshift barricades. Some recognized the sheriff's vehicles and realized that this was more than a wellness check. Word spread quietly, neighbor to neighbor, each house absorbing the shock in waves. Maple Run was small, and Elena was well loved. Her students' parents whispered, wondering how to explain the news to their children. Teachers called each other, their words breaking under the weight of uncertainty. Detective Greeley continued his examination. He noticed the small corkboard of children's drawings in the kitchen. One picture, a crayon landscape with a red-roofed house, had been slightly askew. He straightened it reflexively, then paused, wondering whether it had shifted naturally or if someone had brushed against it. He made a mental note. He also noticed the missing pen from the jar on her desk. It wasn't significant by itself. Pens were easily misplaced. But he wrote it down anyway. Details mattered, especially when everything else seemed too clean. Throughout the afternoon, investigators canvassed neighbors. Most had seen nothing unusual. A few mentioned hearing a dog barking around the time Elena would have been preparing for school. But dogs bark often on County Line Road. One early riser thought they saw a car drive by slowly around 5 in the morning, but they couldn't describe it. Others spoke of how quiet the night had been, how there had been no shouts, no sounds of struggle. One person, though, offered something curious. A neighbor who lived one lot over mentioned hearing music, faint and rhythmic, sometime before dawn. They assumed it was someone's radio or an early worker warming up a truck. When Greeley asked if they recognized the voice between the songs, the neighbor hesitated, saying it might have been the local station someone left playing. The detail felt insignificant at the time, so the note was buried in the report. But years later, that faint mention would take on a different meaning. By evening, the crime scene had been processed, the evidence cataloged. The glass vial, containing the most critical biological trace, was sealed and stored. Officers placed protective tapes across the doors and windows. The house was emptied of any comforting trace of Elena's presence and left still under the weight of unanswered questions. The autopsy confirmed what the scene already suggested. The attack occurred inside the house, not outside, and not through forced entry. Investigators built theories, but without a suspect or immediate lead. Each one dissolved into uncertainty. The lack of fingerprints, the absence of struggle, the intact lock, everything pointed to someone who acted quickly, confidently, and left nothing behind but the evidence preserved in that vial. As the first week passed, grief solidified throughout Maple Run. Teachers moved quietly through school hallways, glancing at Elena's classroom door. Parents held their children a little longer before letting them go inside. Students asked why she wasn't back yet. The principal tried to find the right words and never quite succeeded. The investigation spread wider. Interviews expanded to acquaintances, former classmates, local workers. Among them was a familiar face, a part-time wedding DJ named Ryan Mercer. He claimed he barely knew her. His statements were polite, vague, and cooperative. He blended into the crowd of interviews like a puzzle piece that seemed to fit everywhere and nowhere. Detective Greeley entered his name into the case file, but did not mark it with anything special. There was no reason to. Not then. In the quiet of the closed house, the last odd detail remained unnoticed for days. On the kitchen table, tucked partly beneath the stack of maps, was a fingerprint smudge, and like the others, barely visible, blurred by the condensation that had gathered in the early morning cold. It was impossible to identify and easily dismissed as incidental. But what made it strange was its placement. Not where Elena would rest her fingers, not where someone would naturally brace a hand, but along the edge of the table, near the corkboard where the children's drawings hung. As if someone had leaned there, just briefly before leaving. An imprint of presence without identity. It sat there for days before the surface was cleaned as part of the family's careful effort to preserve her memory. By the time anyone realized it might have mattered, it was long gone. But the glass vial? That survived. And it waited. In the days following Elena Kline's death, the investigation surged with a determined energy, the kind that rises naturally when a community feels struck by something that cannot be explained. Detectives canvassed every house on County Line Road, re-interviewed teachers, questioned every young man who lived within a reasonable radius. For a short while, it felt as though a break might come quickly, like the case was simply waiting for the right detail to tilt into clarity. But that feeling faded. Slowly at first, then with a sharpness that left everyone on edge. The first major lead came from a service repairman who had been scheduled to work in the area. He was familiar with the road and had been near the house several times that week. When detectives brought him in, he sat with slumped shoulders and wide eyes, nervously rubbing his hands against his jeans. He answered everything directly. He remembered seeing Elena once when she was out fetching mail. She had waved at him absent-mindedly. He said he thought she was kind. His alibi, a morning shift that started before dawn at the milling plant, checked out clean. No inconsistencies, no hesitation. He was dismissed, one suspect cleared. Another lead followed when a local man with a history of petty theft was reported wandering near the fields around Elena's home in the early hours of the morning. Detectives tracked him down. His eyes darted as he spoke and his voice trembled. But fear wasn't guilt, they reminded themselves. His mother said he struggled with paranoia, that he often walked the fields when he felt overwhelmed. A look into his activities that morning confirmed he was miles away by the time the crime could have taken place. Another lead dissolved. Detective Greeley met with Elena's parents regularly during the early months. They sat across from him, usually quiet, often hopeful. Her mother, Ruth, spoke softly, always asking if there was anything she could do. Her father, Daniel, rarely said much. He listened, hands folded tightly in front of him. After one meeting, when Greeley told them they were still working every angle, Daniel finally spoke. "I don't understand," he said. "How can someone walk into her home and leave nothing behind?" Greeley had no answer. He only said, "We're still looking, sir." Local media hovered around the investigation, calling the station for updates every week. A reporter once asked whether there was concern about a predator in the community. The sheriff bristled at the suggestion and declined to speculate. Fear, once seated, grew quickly, and they wanted to avoid panic. But behind closed doors, investigators wondered the same thing. How many people should they be looking at? How wide should the search go? In the late spring of 1993, they pursued a third suspect, an out-of-town construction worker whose truck had been recorded driving near the neighborhood at an unusual hour. Detectives found him at a worksite outside Alderford County. He greeted them politely, wiped his brow, and answered every question with calm precision. He explained he had taken a wrong turn after finishing a night shift. Tired, disoriented, not familiar with the roads. His time card placed him at work when the crime occurred. Another theory collapsed. Inside the sheriff's building, the case began to take on a different shape. What had first seemed like a manageable puzzle now looked like an expanse of unclear possibilities. Files stacked up, notes multiplied. Officers debated theories late into the evening. One day, Melissa, still grieving, sat across from Greeley for a follow-up interview. She talked about that morning, her visit to the house, and the way the door had opened too easily. Tears welled when she spoke about the classroom, how Elena's students still asked when she would come back. At one point she whispered, she would have never let someone in unless she knew them. I'm sure of it. Greeley wrote it down, circling the phrase. It aligned with the facts, no forced entry. Still, knowing someone must have been familiar to her did not narrow the search enough to matter. By autumn, the momentum slowed. Leads dried up. The community settled into a tense quiet. Parents watched their children more closely. Neighbors avoided being outside alone at night. The fear had become quieter, more private, but it was still there. In 1994, the task force tried something broader. They looked at young men in nearby counties, reviewed cases of burglary and stalking, assembled psychological profiles. But the crime didn't fit the usual patterns. There was no break-in, no theft, no history from Elena suggesting she was targeted. The randomness made it harder. A young officer asked during a meeting, could this have been a stranger passing through? Greeley shook his head gently. Maybe, but strangers don't usually know which doors open without force. And strangers don't usually disappear without leaving a trace. It became the unspoken thesis of the case. The killer was someone close enough to blend into the background. Over the years, Maple Run learned to absorb the scar. Elena's desk at the school was left untouched for months, until it was eventually cleared by another staff member, not wanting to disturb her parents. A photograph of her was placed in the hallway, framed in muted wood. Candles were lit on anniversaries, small gatherings forming in the school courtyard. Her name became part of the town's vocabulary of grief. Detective Greeley grew older with the case. He sat at his desk late into the evenings, reviewing the same files he knew by heart. He sometimes held the evidence report for the glass vial, turning it over slowly, wondering how something so definitive could feel so incomplete. DNA technology in the mid-1990s hadn't advanced far enough to help. The database had no match. The profile was cataloged and stored, waiting for something it could not yet find. New deputies rotated in. Each one read the case file with fresh eyes, forming theories that eventually unraveled under scrutiny. One deputy proposed that the unknown fingerprint near the corkboard might have belonged to someone visiting recently, unrelated to the crime. Another suggested revisiting the neighbor's story about early morning radio sounds, but it seemed so slim a lead that it couldn't anchor the investigation. The possibility that the voice they heard belonged to someone they all knew seemed too far-fetched at the time. In 1996, a man traveling through Ohio was arrested on unrelated charges and claimed to know something about the case. Detectives arranged an interview. His story shifted each time he told it. First he said he had seen someone running from the house. Then he said he had met Elena once and believed she was followed. Later he admitted he had fabricated parts of his story for attention. His statements were inconsistent and impossible to corroborate. When they dismissed him, he shrugged and said he thought helping might get him leniency. Another dead end. By 1998, the Kline family stopped expecting quick answers. They continued attending every memorial service, but their questions for detectives grew gentler, as if they were afraid to burden them. Once, when Ruth asked if the case was close to being solved, Greeley hesitated. Her eyes filled with worry, and she said, "You don't have to pretend for us." He nodded quietly. A local newspaper published a retrospective in 2000, marking 7 years since the crime. Reporters revisited the details, interviewed residents, and asked whether the killer could still be living among them. The speculation reopened old fear, but the article concluded with a quiet acceptance. The case might never be solved. Some readers clipped it and tucked it away. Others wished it had never been written. In 2004, Greeley pushed for the DNA to be retested using updated methods. The sample yielded a cleaner profile, but still no match in the national system. The report came back with a familiar word: unmatched. He held the paper for a long time, staring at the letters until they blurred. As the years accumulated, the town changed around the investigation. New families moved in, unaware of the weight the older residents carried. Children who once knew Elena grew up, left town, or started families of their own. But the case file remained exactly as it had been, silent and towering over the sheriff's office storage room. Greeley retired in 2012. His last day was quiet. He cleaned out his desk, placed a copy of the case file in a cardboard box, and paused when he reached Elena's photograph. He traced the edge of the picture lightly. He said to the younger detective stepping into his role, "Don't let this one disappear. Someone out there knows something." The younger detective nodded, though he couldn't shake the sense that he was inheriting an impossible weight. By 2015, nothing had changed. Technology had improved, but not enough to offer new avenues. Officers assigned to the case reviewed it periodically, but each review yielded the same conclusion: no leads, no suspects, no forward motion. The file was officially labeled a cold case that year. For the Klines, the grief no longer arrived in sharp waves but in a dull, lingering ache. They still attended the yearly memorials, lighting candles and speaking softly with neighbors. Ruth sometimes said she felt as though she was standing frozen in time, waiting for a voice to return that never would. When the sheriff's department updated its internal list of dormant cases, the Kline case was among the oldest still unresolved. Officers spoke of it with a kind of reverence, as if it were a story passed down rather than an active investigation. People still wondered how someone could enter her home without breaking anything, without leaving a trail that conventional investigation could follow. By the time the case file was placed on the lowest shelf of the storage room, the edges of its pages had softened, and some of the ink had begun to fade. The glass vial in the evidence box remained sealed and intact, waiting with the patience only inanimate objects possess. It was Greeley's final note that encapsulated the despair of the era. On a yellowing page, in neat handwriting, he wrote, "Unless technology changes or someone speaks, we have nowhere left to go." And with that, the file was closed. Time passed in Maple, run the way seasons do on farmland, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. The cornfields changed color, the river thickened then thawed, and the sky stretched over the town with the same stubborn quiet that had always defined it. But for the Kline family, time moved differently. It did not glide. It dragged and caught on memories, resisting the river's current. Every year felt like a circle they were forced to walk again, beginning with the same ache and ending with the same unanswered question. In the first years after Elena's death, her parents kept her room exactly as it had been. The bedspread smoothed each morning, the lamp left off but never unplugged. The shoebox of thank you notes tucked beneath the bed, tied neatly with the same ribbon she used. The river stone rested on the knitstand, untouched. Dust never gathered there. Ruth wiped it every week, as though the act kept her daughter anchored somewhere nearby. There were letters they wrote that they never sent. Notes addressed to Elena, updating her on small things. Neighbors moving, the principal retiring, a former student of hers winning a statewide art contest. Sometimes Ruth wrote about the weather, how much snow fell that year, or how the roses she planted bloomed late one summer. Daniel's letters were fewer, shorter, often just a line or two. "I miss your voice. I saw a bird you would have liked. We are still here." They kept the letters in a drawer, knowing she would never read them, but writing them anyway. It made the days hurt a little less. As the 90s faded into the early 2000s, Maple Run changed. A new grocery store opened, the old feed store shut down, and younger families moved into houses once owned by people who remembered every detail of the town's past. Elena's case became something spoken of only occasionally, in hushed tones during community gatherings or among teachers who still remembered her gentle presence. Those who had known her carried the memory quietly, like a small stone held inside a pocket. Her photograph remained in the school hallway. Children passed it every day, rarely knowing who she was unless their teachers explained. Some paused, sensing something important in the way adults spoke about her. Others learned to walk by without noticing, the way children adapt naturally to whatever world they are given. Ruth and Daniel aged slowly but noticeably. Their hair silvered, their voices softened. Daniel developed the habit of sitting near the window in late afternoons, watching the light shift across the yard. He liked the way the sun fell on the maple tree Elena used to climb when she was young. Ruth cooked more often, filling the house with familiar smells she associated with happier times. Neither needed to say aloud why they stayed in Maple Run, why they didn't move closer to extended family. They both knew leaving the town would feel like abandoning a part of her. Some years they attended community meetings where the sheriff's office gave updates, or rather, repeated the same message. No new leads, no new evidence. The DNA still unmatched. They listened politely, then went home, holding hands more tightly in the car than they once did. People in the community offered comfort, though comfort became thinner with time. A neighbor might say, "We haven't forgotten her," and Ruth would nod, grateful even if the words felt rehearsed. A former student of Elena's once wrote them a letter about how she became a teacher because of her. That letter stayed on the refrigerator for years. In 2004, when the DNA was retested, Ruth allowed herself to hope more than she admitted. She dusted the photo frame twice that week. When the sheriff called to say the test produced a cleaner profile, but still no match, she thanked him with a steady voice. Only after hanging up the phone did she sit down at the kitchen table, fold her hands, and stay still until the kettle whistled. By 2010, the maple tree in their yard stood taller, its branches stretching over the garden. The Klines moved more slowly as they worked outside, but they still planted flowers each spring. They placed one potted plant at the school every year, near the classroom window where Elena once taught. The school staff always made room for it. Friends aged, some passing away, leaving empty chairs at church gatherings and reunions. With each loss, the Klines felt the circle of people who remembered their daughter growing smaller. They found themselves telling stories to younger neighbors, describing her bright laugh or how she kept her classroom tidy but full of life. These stories became a way of keeping her present, even as the world around them moved on. Occasionally a journalist reached out, usually on anniversaries. One came from a regional paper and sat in the Klines' living room, taking notes in a small book. The journalist asked gentle questions about Elena, her dreams, her students. She didn't push for sensational details. When the article was published, Ruth clipped it and placed it in a binder. Daniel read it once, then set it aside, saying softly that it captured her kindness. But no article, no interview, no vigil brought answers. In the mid-2010s, the town felt different. Younger families filled the neighborhoods, new businesses opened, and the old factory reduced its workforce. The air itself seemed to shift, as though the collective memory of the earlier decades was dissolving. Elena's story lived mostly in the hearts of those who loved her, not in the town's daily buzz. Around this time, Ruth began sorting through old boxes. She wasn't clearing them out. She just wanted to see what remained. She found Elena's notebook filled with reflections about her students. Some entries made her laugh. One made her cry. She held the notebook for a long time before placing it on the knitstand beside the river stone, letting the two objects rest together. Daniel discovered a box of photographs, many fading at the edges. Pictures of Elena on her first day of college, smiling with nervous excitement. Pictures of her classroom before she decorated it, bare walls waiting to come alive. He set these aside too, not wanting them to remain hidden in darkness. The years took their toll, but something in the Klines remained unbroken. They endured because there was no alternative. Grief wove itself into their routines until it became familiar, like a quiet companion they no longer resisted. But they never stopped hoping. Even after decades, the smallest idea that someone might someday reopen her case was enough to keep them grounded. In 2015, When the sheriff's department officially labeled the case cold and placed the file on the lowest shelf of the evidence storage room, the Klines didn't attend the meeting. They didn't need to be there for that decision. Instead, they sat on their porch, wrapped in light sweaters, watching the evening settle over Maple Run. They spoke about Elena as they always did, telling small stories, how she used to overwater plants, how she hummed while organizing her desk. These moments kept her close. One evening the same year, a retired teacher stopped Ruth at the grocery store. She placed a gentle hand on Ruth's arm and said, "She mattered so much. You know that, right?" Ruth nodded, eyes stinging. She went home and placed a fresh flower near Elena's picture. It was near the end of 2015 when the first faint mention of genealogical DNA methods started circulating in the community. Someone in town had taken a consumer DNA test and joked at a gathering about discovering long-lost cousins. The idea seemed lighthearted, almost amusing. But later that night, Ruth lay awake thinking about it. She turned to Daniel and whispered, "Do you think someday those things could help her case?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. When he did, he said, "Maybe the world changes. You never know." That small thought, fragile and nearly fleeting, was enough to shift something inside them. Hope didn't return like a flood. It came quietly, like a thin blade of light slipping under a closed door. In early 2016, a young detective named Maya Ortiz, freshly assigned to cold cases, entered the storage basement for the first time. She didn't know the Klines personally yet. She didn't know the decades of sorrow woven into the file she was about to carry upstairs. But she paused at the shelf where the Kline box sat, noticing the worn edges, the faded ink, the meticulous writing of the investigator before her. She lifted the box. It was heavier than she expected. And somewhere in Maple Run, at that same moment, Ruth Kline sat beside the riverstone on Elena's knitstand, brushing away dust she had already brushed away earlier that week. She felt something stir in the air, not certainty, not clarity, but something small and warm, like the first sign of spring after an unforgiving winter. She didn't know why, but she whispered, "Maybe this year." She had no way of knowing that she was right. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. The day Detective Maya Ortiz reopened the Kline case began like most others, with a quiet walk down the worn steps into the sheriff's evidence basement. She didn't expect anything remarkable that morning. Her job was to review dormant files, update aging logs, and determine which cases had even the faintest chance of responding to modern methods. The air smelled faintly of metal and cold dust. Shelves rose around her in dim lines, carrying decades of unresolved stories that waited without expectation. When she reached the bottom shelf, her eyes landed on a familiar box. The handwriting on the label was different from most others, clean, careful, almost tender. Kline, E-1993. She recognized the case from local memory, from the occasional articles still circulating online, from quiet conversations she overheard among older officers. People didn't forget Elena. They simply learned to speak of her in softer tones. Maya pulled the box forward, already feeling the subtle weight of responsibility shifting onto her shoulders. She opened it carefully, unwrapping layers until the glass DNA vial appeared in her hands. Frost clung to the interior walls like a thin ghost, as if time still lived inside the glass. She held the vial up to the fluorescent light, watching the faint glimmer of what remained. It was more than evidence. It was a frozen breath from a life stolen long before the world had the tools to understand it. She signed the chain of custody form and carried the box upstairs with a steady, deliberate stride. Hours later, the sealed evidence sat in the backseat of her car as she drove to the Columbus Forensic Lab. The sky above her stretched in cold gray bands. She didn't know what would come of it, but she knew she couldn't let the sample sit another year in silence. At the lab, technicians greeted her with a mix of curiosity and measured optimism. They had seen cases like this, old files suddenly revived by technology that didn't exist when the crime occurred. Maya didn't say much as she handed the box over, but her posture betrayed her hope. She stayed to observe, watching through the protective glass as the team began their disciplined choreography. Technicians thawed the vial slowly, letting the frost recede until the steel cap no longer held condensation. Each movement was careful, almost reverent. The sample was extracted in small increments, transferred into sterilized tubes, and prepared for the next generation sequencing system. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden revelation. Only the soft hum of machines, the blink of indicators, and the quiet diligence of people who understood that science is built on patience. Over the next hours, fragments of genetic information appeared across screens, stringing themselves into patterns. Technicians manipulated data, cleaned noise, adjusted baselines. By late afternoon, a profile emerged complete enough to enter into the genealogical matching system that had solved dozens of cold cases across the country. As the computer processed the data, Maya stepped back, rubbing her hands together instinctively. The room felt colder than it actually was. She watched the progress bar move steadily across the screen. When it finished, the system displayed a list of partial matches, distant relatives scattered across Ohio and neighboring states. The mapping team stepped in, tracing family trees, cross-referencing public records, and eliminating branches that held no viable suspects. Hours stretched into days. The web of connections grew clearer. Every few hours, an analyst would mark a line, strike another, or highlight a possible branch. The work felt like solving a puzzle where most pieces were missing, yet gradually, shapes emerged. The Mercer, Caro, and Vandelin families formed the strongest cluster. Their roots were deeply anchored in the Midwest, and several members had lived in Alderford County around the time of the crime. As analysts narrowed the tree, the circle tightened. Male relatives were filtered by age, location, and availability during the early 1990s. And then one name surfaced, unassuming, familiar: Ryan Mercer. Local DJ, part-time factory worker in the 90s, interviewed once during the original investigation. Known by nearly everyone in Maple Run, his name looked innocuous on the screen, but as the analysts overlaid his age, address history, and proximity to Elena's home, something clicked. He had lived less than 2 miles from her in 1993. He had been awake early most mornings, preparing for events or commuting to factory shifts. And he had brushed shoulders with countless people in town without ever drawing suspicion. The genealogical team flagged his name. Maya stared at it for a long, silent moment. Something tightened in her chest. She recognized the name not from case files, but from the edges of her own memories of town gatherings. School fundraisers, county fairs, weddings, always smiling behind a set of speakers, always offering a friendly wave. The forensic lab needed direct comparison, so local officers discreetly retrieved a discarded item belonging to Mercer. A coffee cup left on a table at a music event carried enough viable DNA to test. The results came back 24 hours later. The genetic markers aligned perfectly. The match percentage was absolute, undeniable, immovable. The quiet air in the lab seemed to deepen as the truth settled in. The DNA from Elena's case, locked in a frozen vial for more than 2 decades, now pointed directly at a man who had lived among her community, celebrated with them, and played songs at their weddings. Maya didn't speak at first. She read the report twice, then again. A technician murmured, "There's no question. This is your guy." No one in the room sounded triumphant. The tone was something else entirely, a mix of disbelief and solemn confirmation. Justice, when delayed this long, never arrives with clean edges. It enters quietly, creating a pendulum swing between relief and sorrow. The twist came later that week, when Maya began digging into Mercer's history. She found photographs of him performing at charity events in the late 90s, including the annual memorial fundraiser for Elena's scholarship program. In one picture, he stood beside a banner bearing her name, microphone in hand, smiling beneath warm string lights. That image struck harder than the lab result. He hadn't just hidden. He had embedded himself into the fabric of remembrance. He had played music while her parents sat in the front row, grieving. He had offered condolences at gatherings, spoken kindly about her memory, and stood silently while the town processed its loss. He had woven himself into the safety of the community that trusted him without question. The revelation traveled back to Maple Run like a harsh winter wind. Officers briefed the sheriff. A warrant was prepared. The arrest happened quietly, without spectacle. Residents watched from windows or paused mid-step as officers placed the man they had known for decades into a transport vehicle. The news spread fast. Phones rang. Messages flew across town. Conversations at the diner stopped in mid-sentence. There were people who refused to believe it. Others who said they always felt something off. Many simply stared, unable to reconcile the face they knew with the truth now laid bare by science. When word reached the Klines, it came gently. The sheriff visited them in person, sitting across from them at their kitchen table, speaking in a calm voice softened by years of shared sorrow. Ruth listened with her hands clasped together, as though bracing herself against emotion. Daniel closed his eyes slowly, as if absorbing each word with the gravity it deserved. For a long moment after the sheriff finished speaking, the house fell quiet. The ticking of a clock in the hallway marked the seconds. Ruth finally whispered, "We waited so long." Her voice carried neither triumph nor anger, only the soft tremble of release. Daniel reached for her hand and held it tightly. Later that night, Ruth walked into Elena's room, where the Riverstone still sat on the knitstand. She traced its smooth surface with her fingers. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. For the first time in decades, she felt something shift inside her, not closure, not fully, but a doorway opening into light. In town, people gathered in small groups, trying to make sense of what they had learned. Some felt betrayed. Others felt naive. But many felt a kind of collective exhale. A wound that had never healed properly was finally being touched by truth. The next morning, Maya returned to her office. She placed the lab report into the case file, closing the binder with quiet finality. The DNA that had waded through decades of technological evolution had finally spoken. And in the clarity it brought, the entire community began to breathe differently. Justice hadn't arrived fast. It hadn't arrived easily. But it had arrived. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. The morning officers arrived at Ryan Mercer's house. The sky hung low with pale clouds, stretched thin from the winter air settling over Maple Run. The neighborhood was quiet, still waking, unaware of what was about to unfold. Mercer stepped outside, carrying a box of equipment from his most recent weekend event, his breath floating in small clouds ahead of him. He did not expect anyone to be waiting on the sidewalk. When he saw the uniforms, his expression froze in a half-smile that never reached his eyes. The arrest happened with a formality that left no room for confusion. Officers approached with measured steps, speaking his name clearly, informing him of the warrant. Mercer nodded, questions forming but never fully voiced. His gaze flickered briefly toward the house across the street, as though looking for someone who might appear and vouch for him. But no one stepped outside. People were still inside their homes, brewing coffee, oblivious to the fracture occurring on their street. Mercer's hands were secured, and he was guided into the patrol car. His head turned once toward the town he had lived in his entire life, as if expecting it to defend him. It didn't. Word spread quickly. By afternoon, the diner was filled with murmured speculation. People whispered in disbelief, each trying to reconcile the man they knew, the DJ who played the soundtrack to countless celebrations, with the truth emerging from the sheriff's office. Some insisted there must be a mistake. Others, quietly but firmly, said the science didn't lie. Conversations carried a tone caught between betrayal and relief. Mercer's arraignment took place in a courthouse that had seen generations of small-town disputes, but rarely a case that shook the community's foundation. The room filled early. Some came because they remembered Elena. Others came because they couldn't grasp the idea that the man they had trusted so fully was now the center of a decades-old tragedy. Maya Ortiz sat near the front, watching as Mercer entered wearing the standard orange of detainees, his wrists bound loosely at his sides. He didn't look toward the public seating. His face was drained of the easy charm he once wore like a uniform. The prosecutor outlined the case briefly. The DNA match from the preserved sample, the discarded cup confirming the result. Mercer's proximity to Elena during the time of the crime, his early morning routines, the lack of forced entry that suggested familiarity. Mercer listened without reaction, as if hearing the charges from far away. His attorney argued for caution, citing the age of the case, the unreliability of memories, the possibility of contamination. But the weight of modern technology overshadowed each point. The DNA was clean. The match was absolute. The court acknowledged as much, setting the stage for trial. When the trial finally began, months later, the courtroom was bathed in the soft gold of afternoon sunlight, streaming through tall windows. Dust floated in the air in slow patterns, giving the room an almost solemn quiet. People filled the benches, shifting occasionally, whispering names from the past. The Klines sat together, hands intertwined. Ruth held a folded tissue in her hand, though she had not yet used it. Daniel watched the front with a stillness that had taken years to form. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence first. A lab specialist explained the thawing of the vial, the extraction, the sequencing, each step spoken with the steady cadence of someone accustomed to revealing truth in increments. Charts and diagrams were displayed, but the narrative remained clear. The DNA from the crime scene belonged to Ryan Mercer, with a statistical certainty that left no grounds for dispute. The genealogical expert followed, describing how distant relatives formed the backbone of the family tree that led investigators to Mercer. This part of the testimony captivated the room. People leaned forward as though seeing science reshape the memory of their town in real time. The expert pointed to clusters on a diagram, explaining how each connection narrowed the search. When Mercer's branch was highlighted, several people in the audience exhaled in stunned silence. Melissa testified next. Her voice was gentle but steady as she recalled the morning she found the door open, the strange quiet inside, the rising dread. She described the cold air that met her, the sense that something terrible had happened before she even stepped inside. She spoke not of violence, but of absence, the absence of footsteps, of sound, of the usual signs of morning activity that had always filled Elena's home. The room listened with respect, her grief evident but controlled. Ryan Mercer did not testify. He sat throughout the trial with his eyes lowered when witnesses spoke, occasionally lifting them during breaks to glance around the courtroom. But his gaze never landed on anyone for long. He offered no explanation, no denial, no clarifying words. Whether he felt resignation or calculation, no one could be certain. The silence became its own statement. In closing arguments, the prosecution focused on the precision of the evidence. The defense tried to cast doubt on the chain of custody, the storage of the vial, the reliability of genealogical tracing. But the arguments felt thin next to the long and meticulous work presented by the forensic specialists. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the courtroom's hush tightened into something brittle. Deliberations didn't take long. The jury filed back into the courtroom with expressions that gave little away. The foreperson rose, holding a slip of paper that had been folded so carefully the crease lines were sharp. When the verdict was read guilty on all charges, the room remained quiet for several long seconds. It wasn't the kind of moment that triggered cheers or outbursts. It was a moment of profound exhale. The Klines leaned into each other. Ruth's shoulders trembled as she held Daniel's hand, and though tears welled, she didn't let them fall until the judge thanked the jury for their service. After the verdict, Mercer was escorted out. He paused once before passing through the door, his eyes sweeping over the room one final time. There was no plea for forgiveness, no final statement. He was simply a man walking away from the town he had lived in for decades, the weight of truth finally catching him after years of evasion. Outside, the courthouse steps filled with quiet conversations. People spoke in low voices, each sentence layered with the understanding that their community, its trust, its rhythm, its sense of safety, had been shaken in ways they were still learning to comprehend. Some people discussed the science with awe. Others focused on the sorrow of what had been lost. A few simply said that they had always known something in the air of that old case didn't feel right. Maya found the Klines near the walkway. They approached her with slow, deliberate steps. Daniel thanked her first, his voice stronger than expected. Ruth reached out and touched Maya's hand, saying only, "Thank you for giving us the truth." Maya nodded, unable for a moment to find her own words. She felt the weight of their gratitude settle into her, heavier than the case files she had carried all these years of her career. Later that evening, the Klines returned home. The house felt different. Not lighter, not happier, but steadier, as though something long suspended had finally settled into place. Ruth walked into Elena's room and sat beside the knitstand. She picked up the river stone and closed her hand around it. It was smooth and familiar, worn from years of being handled by a daughter who sought small comforts. In that moment, she felt connected to Elena in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching quietly. Ruth looked up at him and whispered, "She can rest now." He nodded, leaning his hand against the doorframe, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and release. In the sheriff's office, Maya returned to her desk. The case file lay open, pages spread out like a history that no longer felt incomplete. She read the final lab report again, the numbers and percentages stark and certain. When she closed the folder, she paused before placing it into the cabinet designated for resolved cases. It didn't feel like closure exactly, more like the end of a long echo that had finally faded. That night, Maple Run was quiet. The town carried the weight of truth in its bones, but also a sense of renewed stillness. A chapter had closed, not perfectly, not without pain, but decisively. Justice had taken 26 years to arrive. But it had arrived. In the months after the verdict, Maple Run settled into a quieter rhythm. People still spoke about the case, but the tone had changed. The urgency was gone, replaced with something softer, like the last glow of a lantern before it's gently blown out. The fear that once hovered over the town had receded, leaving behind a cautious but genuine sense of healing. Life did not return to what it had been before the crime time refuses to bend backward, but it moved forward with steadier steps. At Maple Run Elementary, the hallway photograph of Elena was reframed. A new border of warm oak replaced the older worn frame, and beneath it, the school placed a small brass plaque engraved with her name. The principal explained to students that the picture honored a teacher who had loved them long before they arrived. For many of the children, the story of what happened to her was not told directly, but they sensed something meaningful in the quiet way adults straightened the frame when they passed. In the Kline household, the air felt different. Sorrow remained, but it no longer pressed down with the same weight. It lived instead as memory, gentler, familiar, woven into the details of daily life. Ruth kept the river stone on the knitstand, just as Elena had. But now she held it less out of grief and more as a reminder of the small comforts her daughter once sought. Daniel spent more time in the garden, tending the flowers they planted each year in her name. When neighbors stopped by to offer condolences or share stories, he listened with a steadiness that came from knowing the truth had finally been spoken. Detective Maya Ortiz moved on to other cases, but she kept a copy of the Kline file stored in her desk. She sometimes reread sections of it not out of habit, but out of respect for what the case had taught her. That time is not the enemy of justice, and truth can survive in places where no one thinks to look, waiting for the moment when science or persistence finally catches up. She remembered the weight of the glass vial in her hands the day she pulled it from the basement shelf. It was a reminder that even the smallest fragment of evidence can carry an entire story inside it. People in Maple Run began to reclaim the spaces that once held fear. The path along County Line Road saw more walkers again. Evening gatherings returned to backyards and porches. The local radio station, once a source of unease for those who remembered the early morning broadcasts from decades past, became just another part of the town's background noise, its meaning restored to normalcy. What lingered most strongly in the community was a lesson spoken quietly. Evil can hide in the most familiar faces, but truth has a way of reaching outward, seeking light. People became more attentive, not suspicious, but aware. They checked in on one another more often. They listened more deeply. A sense of connection, once fractured, began to mend along new lines. On the anniversary of Elena's death, a small gathering formed at the school. There were no speeches, no formal event. Just neighbors, former students, and families who felt compelled to come. They placed flowers below her photograph and stood in a circle of soft conversation. The sky overhead was gray, but a thin brightness pressed through the clouds, enough to cast a pale glow across the hallway tiles. Ruth and Daniel stood quietly at the edge of the group. Ruth held the river stone in her palm, rubbing it gently with her thumb. Daniel placed his hand over hers, steady and reassuring. Neither spoke, but both felt something close to peace, the kind that comes when long-sought answers finally rest alongside memory. When the gathering dispersed, Ruth returned the stone to her pocket and whispered a small thank you, whether to the people, the town, or the passage of time itself, she couldn't say. She only knew that the world felt a little more whole than it had the year before. The story of Elena Kline became part of Maple Run's legacy, not as a tale of fear, but as proof that justice can move at its own pace and still arrive with purpose. Her life, her classroom, and her quiet acts of kindness left traces that endured far longer than the darkness that took her away. And in the end, as the last light of the day stretched across the fields, the town felt different. Not healed entirely, but steadied. Not triumphant, but grateful. A chapter had closed with clarity, and the future, though still uncertain, felt a little brighter. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.